Well, hello, everybody. Welcome back to Unslaved. We are back today doing part two of the show we did last week, getting into the deception of the Dead Sea Scrolls, or sorry, the Dead Sea Scrolls deception. There's so much going on with this subject that Michael decided to do a multi-parts on it. I'm thoroughly interested in it, and I'm very excited to dive back into this one today, getting into people like John Allegro and so many others that were part of that discovery. Michael, as we did that first show, I couldn't help but think about how many people I've mentioned the Dead Sea Scrolls to that still didn't even know what the hell I was talking about. So there's definitely levels of understanding when it comes to this. And then there's the people that have heard of it, but have maybe only heard brief mention of it and never really understood how it came together, who was involved, and what was actually discovered, or that there's still ongoing studies into the scrolls and how they relate to the Bible and the Old Testament and Judaism and all of that. And so this has just been a great series. The first part we did was just an introduction, but we're going to be getting deeper into the weeds today, aren't we?
Yeah, and you're quite right about that problem. There was a flurry around the late 80s and the early 90s, and that's because that's when the university in America released the Dead Sea Scrolls, on microfiche, which had been long awaited. So you can imagine that during the build-up to that, and then in the aftermath, it became more public. People did start talking about the Dead Sea Scrolls. There was also a slew of, sort of BBC programs on it. Some of these Dead Sea Scroll scholars were alive. Barbara Thiering, Herschel Shanks, Professor Eisenman, so some of them even got, in fact, even John Allegro got a documentary made. He had a lot of problems getting it made, and one other documentary he made was scrapped. He never saw the light of day. But there was a shorter version of even a documentary he had made, which was aired, a safer one, so to speak. So around that late 80s into the 90s period, Gnosticism became popular, and also did this Dead Sea Scrolls thing. But then, as we would suspect, once the hoopla was over and everybody thought that the documents were all now published, so to speak, it lapsed from concern, and other headlines took over. And actually, it's never actually come back. Like you say, people have maybe heard of it, but it lapsed. And also, don't forget, that was the part of the agenda. The holding back by the church for that length of time was in a hope that they would just grind everyone down. And that with all the different political headlines and all these other things taking place, Desert Storm, whatever, this was the idea that people would, it would be a flash in the pan. And one school believed that really at the end of the day, there wasn't that many revelations that really mattered so much that the earth shook. Then there's another school that says, but you haven't read deep enough. And also these bloody people at the international team have parsed it out so much that the impact of what has been discovered hasn't really reached the public. There's been doctoring involved. There's been heavy editing involved. There's a school that believe that, mostly in America, but other scholars too. And so it was split down the middle as what the actual impact of the revelations were. The way I look at all of that, because I've been into this since those years, or late 80s into the 90s, is that Christians know very, very little about their own religion. This is more, to me, what is at stake. Jews know also very little about the origins of their religion, right? And this is what the conspirators, so to speak, really bet on. You see, they know that there'll be an interest. These things peak. There's even programs and documentaries, but it's all right. If the average Christian only believes in the superficial doctrine that is taught at the local church or whatever, or is just flicked through the Bible or something, has never asked deep questions, and the Jews basically done the same, they are not so worried. And then they can be arrogant about these secrets. It's amazing. You think that the earth would shatter under them, when these Nag Hammadi documents, texts, the Dead Sea Scrolls, and then don't forget all the other apocryphal works, Book of Enoch, Book of Jasher, Book of Baruch.
Yeah.
They're seriously compromising. We'll be talking about Tony Bushby later on. He was following the discovery in the Vatican archives of a thing called the Vatican Scrolls. And when he wrote his books partly around those discoveries, they're revolutionary. The Vatican Scrolls literally undermine most of everything in the New Testament. And it comes from the archives of the Vatican. The identity of Mary, the identity of Jesus, how many brothers he had, and all of this. And Tony Bushby also was an expert in, he knew the Talmud, so he would cross-reference, biblical reference with the same references in the Talmud and look at all the inconsistencies. And there are many, right? Then he looked at behind-the-scenes revelations that, like they said, the Vatican Scrolls, things that came out that the public never heard about. The other thing that he was an expert in is comparing and contrasting actual Bibles, one to the other. Right? And
there's so many different ones.
All different and all contradictory. Not just within the Bible, the gospel stories are full of contradictions. Zoom out and start comparing other, through the 200 years, 300 years, through the centuries. One Bible, one century, like in the 7th century, will be completely different than the one in the 17th century. So Bushby is one of the experts on that. Then he also was doing that. And like I said, he knew the Talmud inside out, and he knew these apocryphal works inside out. And so he did one of these massive, comparisons, unlike anybody else. That's why I hone in on him. I could hone in on hundreds of scholars, but I even pared it down, when you're on camera and you're talking to the world. You can't bring all of those guys in. So I put them on the website, astrotheology, something like that. But really, when we're doing programs like this, you just hone into those Ralph Ellis's and Tony Bushby's and Joseph Atwell's, a handful of names that are available, the Bay Genton Lays and people like that, the Picnet and Princes. I try to narrow it down. Then I wrote in my volumes, Irish Origins, again, carving it up, taking out the essentials to present it to a modern audience, because it's a vast subject. We talked about that. It's so vast that you wouldn't even want to pick this up unless you had an endurance of a mule and a donkey. I mean, it's so labyrinthine, and there's so many tangents to get into. But I wanted to do this since I got into these things in the early 90s,
Well, that's incredible.
If life hadn't changed for me, luckily, I would have been a Gnostic. I was heading in that direction. I was, just don't want to get into it all, but I would have easily conformed when I got to America. And even before that, I had a part of me that was inclined toward, just accepting the dogma of Gnosticism. I found it sort of interesting. And then it was this, sequence of events that got me completely snapped out of it. Intense research and just keeping an open mind, So I changed. I became anti, probably from reading the Alvin Boyd Kuhn's, multiple reasons. But finally, I became an anti-Gnostic. We can talk about that maybe another time. But then I wanted to share that with the world. But then what format are you going to use, and all of this. So just so pleased that we're able to get to this right now. Yeah. It took a long time, though.
Well, that's amazing. And I know it did because of the depth of reading you would have had to do to go through all of it, like all these authors. Like if anybody goes to the astrotheology website, you just go to the appendices and you go through all the names that are listed. Each one of those names are like titans of guys that put their intellect and their work into writing many, many works on this, many books on it. And then to have that unique quality to be able to look at different takes on even these discoveries, right? Because there's the fact that we talk about the different takes on the Bible itself, which are infinite. For me, the fact that they have these Seventh-day Adventists and Jehovah's Witnesses and Mormons and all these like little side cults. And then you see that Christianity, the canon of Christianity is used by some of these more like real obvious cults like the Solar Temple and Heaven's Gate. Like they bring in those elements. That is one thing. But then there's also these discoveries, and then each author will maybe have their way of looking at it. And then maybe just before we jump into the slides, do you have any advice for people on how one can look at such a labyrinth and try to organize it? Like, are you just looking for the patterns? Is it that pattern recognition? Because sometimes we can see the patterns we want to see. Like, how do we guard against that? That's probably where religion came from to begin with, right? Where there's this quality we have to see the patterns, but then there's the other part of it that's like, well, are we also avoiding seeing other patterns that we don't want to see, right? So, like, investigation into such a subject, it becomes a very personal journey in the end, right? Like, it's about you going through and what resonates, what doesn't, what has the most logic behind it, who makes the best argument. Do you have any advice for people when they're getting into studying something like the Dead Sea Scrolls or
Oh yeah,
religion, how to
yeah,
organize their thinking on it?
yes. I would say there's a couple of points. One is go slow. That's the main thing. Go slow. It demands attention. The subject itself is deep and insightful. So be conscientious and give it the time that it deserves. This is not for sound bites. This is not for rushing. Secondly, of course, don't do it from a dogmatic point of view. Don't do it to reinforce a dogma. Be completely skeptical and open. Because those masters that you talked about, a few of which I represent on the astrotheology site, and much more on in my Irish Origins books. There's loads of people mentioned there, right? Even more. But even if you took the ones that I've mentioned on the astrotheology side, they all have one thing in common. They were highly skeptical people. They taught me to be this way, right? You can't go in front of Gerald Massey and Alwyn Boyd Kuhn and James Wheelis and John Remsburg and Kiersey Graves and be a shoddy thinker. They will not leave one scrap. It's scorched earth. They won't leave a scrap of your dogma for you to cling to. They'll strip you fucking naked and give you the biggest kicking of your life mentally. So you'll be the Krishnamurti is probably the worst of the lot.
Yeah.
They won't leave you with one single shred of dogma. Doesn't leave you with theosophy, doesn't leave you to cling to Hinduism or Gnosticism or any ism whatsoever. All are burned. You're shaved right down to the bone. And many of these other thinkers that I got attracted to, and this includes the Colin Wilsons, the other people I was reading at the time, Carl Jung, it falls into this. There's certain people with this corrosive. Freud was fucking way like that, this corrosive attitude and mentality. I like it. I got used to it. It was very refreshing. And so that would be my advice. Go slow. Give it the patience it's due. This is gnosis. This is knowledge. But at the same time, don't be dogmatic where you're reinforcing some idiotic, doctrine so that you can be against everybody else.
Right.
Me against the world. No, that won't work. That's not the way of a scholar. And then also fall in love with this corrosive, deconstructive attitude so that you can see through delusion. That is, of course, the old message of Michael Tessarian, that the controllers, your masters, are way ahead of you and always have been for thousands of years. They know your weaknesses. And so they've really set up a major architecture of control. So if you're a novice and you're coming at it, you're going to lose. You're going to fucking way lose unless you've got some major cards up your sleeve. And those cards are these great men.
That's yeah.
That's it.
No, that's great advice. That's perfect. It kind of reminds me of like what I try to tell these kids that I'm teaching martial arts to, keep that white belt mentality. Like, even what I'm teaching you, remember, is my slant on it. There's many ways to look at it. I tell them there's like the basic fundamental laws that you cannot break of just physics and how the body works. And then there's infinite variation within that. And I'd say it's the same with this work. There's, like you've always said it too, it's not just that these guys that have different takes on this information are all contradicting each other because they're all juggling some giant lie or something. It's that there's variation on this mystery that we're studying. And because religion has to do with the mystery, and